A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Why don't we have a conversation about sex? We're human, designed by our Maker to reproduce as God intended, and that means we look to understand what His intent is in being sexual. We were created to be male and female. So today we're unpacking 5 cultural lies about sex. And our special guest today says being appropriately sexual has a 4-fold purpose. It's often confused because even though John declared God is love, this should not be confused with the idolatrous concept that love is God. Well, Dr. Andrew Corbett is joining us. He's back with us, pastor at Legana Christian Church in northern Tasmania. He's the author of several books and is the national president of ICI Theological College Australia, a theological distance education provider. Andrew Corbett, a special welcome back to 2020.
And it's great to be with you, Neil. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hey, Andrew, let's lay a little foundation here. Humanity and a sexual purpose. Sometimes we want to distance sex from Christianity and from religion and from God, but we're created by God and there is a sexual purpose that He has.
There is, and the fact that you've put a warning out for parents to, guard little ears, I understand that, but it also... It highlights the challenge that we've got as Christians to make sense of this topic in a world that is nonsense. And I think, we can look at so much that's going on in society and at the core of it, Neil, we've got a distorted view of the very purpose of sex.
Well, we've got this degendering of society right now, and so what has been for the history of the world normal, male and female, complementary sexes, somehow or other that has been thrown into disarray, and really we're only talking about the last 7 years. So in the last 5 minutes of history, everything's changing. So somehow or other that's going to lead us in all sorts of bad directions. But how do you understand this complementarity that we have between the sexes, male and female?
Yes, and Neil, this is such a relevant topic. I mean, we cannot risk being irrelevant with this. We are all created to be sexual. We live in a world that is highly sexualized. Part of my motive here, Neil, is I heard that there was a very famous Australian preacher who was quite a famous national and international Bible teacher. And toward the end of his life, he said, I have one regret, and that regret is I did not talk and teach more about sex. And you might think, how's that possible in a church? We don't talk about these things. Why on earth would this highly esteemed Bible teacher say that it was his largest regret? And this is the problem. This is the problem that we've got. We think it's a taboo topic. We shouldn't talk about it. And so by us not talking about it, especially to the next generation, they are being taught, Neil. They are being taught by someone, and what they are being taught is probably, almost certainly, by sheer observation, we can see, is not what God has designed for this precious gift. So how do I see it? That's how I see it. I see this as a God-given gift. Our sex, that is, our biological sex, is a gift from God. It's a it's a gift from God that ultimately, Neil, we'll have this for eternity. Men will be resurrected to become true men, and women will be resurrected to become true women. And this is something that God celebrates. And then the act of sex is something that does, as I've mentioned, and you've alluded to, it has a 4-fold purpose. And a lot of people think it only has 1 or maybe 2 purposes. But in God's design, there's 4 very precious purposes for this. And I would say, Neil, most Christians, especially most young Christians, are not aware that it has a fourfold purpose.
Let's touch on that fourfold purpose, and we might not have time, even in a longer conversation, to be able to unpack all four of these. But for anyone listening right now thinking, oh really, I just thought this was something that was on the side, let's talk about a fourfold purpose. Can you describe those briefly?
Yeah, so when we talk about the act of sex, it is for the gift of marriage as well. And most people may only be thinking in terms of both marriage and sex having two purposes. One might be to procreate, and perhaps there will be some people that have the idea that's the only purpose for marriage and the only purpose for sex. But that's not what the Bible says at all. In fact, when we look at the foundation of Scripture in Genesis 1 and 2, and I'm of the belief that there is a Hebrew writing style in chapter 1 which gives the overview, and then chapter 2 gives the detail of it. And what we see there is that when God created the man and he told him to examine all of the animals in that, presumably in that locale, that there was not found a helper, and the Hebrew word is azer, and that's a powerful word for us to really comprehend that does not mean a maid servant or some. God is not saying to Adam, "I want to create a housekeeper for you. I want to create a cook, a cleaner, a washer, and all the rest of it." That's not it. That's not what the word azer means. In fact, that word azer is the adjective that is used more often about God's relationship to his people than any other word. And it's more akin to the word ally. It's an ally. And when you think about that word, help or helpmeet, I think the King James is, it's a word that is not an inferior. It's actually someone who can bring aid. Now, when we think of what's happening in the world at the moment, we think of the conflict sadly happening in and around Gaza and Israel. And recently, the president or prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, appealed to the United States for aid, to come to their aid. And that's the Hebrew word, azer. That's the same word that's used of God's intention to create the woman. So immediately what we see as far as sex and marriage and gender is that man and woman were created equal but different. And that's the word you just used, Neil, complementary, that the man has certain strengths given by God, the woman has certain strengths and capacities given by God, and together they complement. And I think if people understood that, we lay a foundation for what the act of sex and gender roles can become.
Absolutely full of wisdom, the thought that we are allies together in marriage, man and woman, complementary, created in the image of God. And you like to describe that as you talk about the fourfold purpose, that this is a crowning act of creation. And beautiful to hear you describe, this is the sort of relationship that God has with humanity and then humanity has with one another. That's just a fabulous way of actually putting God into the right perspective, into the right context here.
Yes, and when you begin to see that firstly, that union between the man and a woman, that's one of the purposes. So we have that initially, I will make a companion or a helper, an ally for him. So sex and marriage is a package deal, and this is why I think the enemy of our soul and the enemy of really the people of the world, because he hates our enemy hates God's people, and he wants to do all he can to distort and destroy the gifts of God. And one of the most precious gifts of God is this package deal of sex and marriage. And so with that, we see that there's a purpose of sex to bring two people together, and that's where in Genesis 2 they're described as becoming one. And that word one means one in heart and mind and in fellowship, and so it solves the companionship problem. And Neil, we've just come through a global pandemic, And someone has said, but there's another pandemic that's been going on and is still going on, and it's the pandemic of loneliness. And so I'm saying to you, one of the purposes of sex and marriage is to deal with that problem of a lack of companionship and loneliness. Neil, that's one of the four reasons God has designed and ordained sex and marriage.
Okay, so a conversation about marriage, but deepening that even another further step as you begin to describe the sexual purpose to reproduce, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and this connection that you have one to another. But taking that a step deeper, when we talk about being fruitful and multiply, we're talking about children in the equation, and the way that fruitfulness, that multiplication, that belongingness happens within a family environment. How do you briefly describe, how that all works together? Because there's a certain culture that begins to build once you have this fruitfulness and bearing children.
Absolutely, Neil. Let's consider the biblical narrative here, where it describes God creating this woman, and she is not called Eve in Genesis 2. She's called woman, and that is the Hebrew word Isha. In Hebrew, the word Ish means male or man. Isha means female or woman. And the reason this is significant is because she's created with a power that Adam himself did not have, and that is, as you say, the power to be fruitful and reproduce not just creatures, but more creatures in the image of God. Now, here's the thing I think we need to understand, that the enemy of our soul was somewhat, indifferent to Adam. And so Adam on his own was no threat to anybody. But the moment God created the woman, the moment God created the Isha with the capacity, of course, in complementarian sexual relationship with Adam, the moment she was created, we read in Genesis chapter 3:1, the entrance of this alien, this enemy of our soul. It says, and the serpent was the craftiest beast of the field, and he said to the woman. And so the target of Satan, the enemy, was to destroy the woman. And I would say they are still in the crosshairs of Satan because they have this exquisite and beautiful gift from God to create life. Of course, with the man. But here we have this beautiful gift. Now, today, I think the enemy has done a number on so many people that children are an inconvenience, children are not a gift, they are a curse or a problem or a pain, they are an economic burden, and so on and so on. And I think that's a lie. It's actually a part of the cultural lie about sex, that children are going to be an inconvenience and a problem. And this is, as you say, this is an idea essentially that's 5 minutes old, Neil. Up until not that long ago, children were seen as a gift. They were seen as a blessing, and we have in the Bible, it actually describes them like that. So we are dealing with a cultural lie that says children are an inconvenience and so on, but God says no. They're a gift. And this is this gift that man and woman together, but particularly the woman. And this is where I think, Neil, if we had the time, we'd actually cross over into this great problem at the moment, and that's domestic violence, generally the treatment of men against women, rather than seeing women with this beautiful gift and this beautiful gift from God to create new life.
You've got these complementary man and woman. You've got the one flesh idea. You've got the be fruitful and multiply idea. But this physical satisfaction, I know this is a dimension here of those purposes that you talk about, and beyond an initial union, you've got a lifelong capacity for physical satisfaction and consummation together.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is something that we need to recognise, that God has given a husband and a wife, because marriage is the package, and within that package is the gift, and the gift is the act of sex. And this is why I think as parents, I'm parent of 4 surviving children, and we talk about this with our children, and this is something that I hope more parents can talk about this with their children. That's why I've written this booklet, which is a study guide for parents and for youth leaders to be able to take their younger people through the 5 cultural lies about sex. And so this is where we need to appreciate that God has given this gift, yes, for pleasure. And it's a holy pleasure. In fact, I cite in this booklet Dr. Christopher Yuan, who describes this as holy sexuality. And holy sexuality doesn't mean that we treat this as an icky thing. It means that we treat it as a holy gift from God to be treasured, not to be trifled with, not to be outside of the covenant of marriage. And so I think, yes, pleasure is one of the 4 purposes of marriage. Children.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.